It's 1:30 in the morning, and you've just come off of your break. You see two people at a table in your section of the restaurant. As you approach them to take their orders, you immediately feel that something is extremely off about these two. One of them, a man with emotionless, dead eyes, stares straight ahead, eerily focused on the little girl sitting across from him. She is visibly unwashed, her skin, clothes, hair, all filthy. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Your intuition screams that something is very wrong here. When you try to ask her if she wants something to drink, she doesn't respond, until the man, continuing to look at her, appears to nod his approval. She looks up at you and asks for a milkshake. That's when you recognize her. Her face has been all over town, on posters, signs, and billboards, ever since she disappeared weeks ago. But where has she been all this time? And if it really was her, then where is her brother? You will soon discover that this little girl is in fact the one everyone's been searching for, and only has she used her bravery and intelligence to survive certain death. But she has been conducting a cleverly orchestrated series of events that has led her to be here, right now, in your restaurant, so that someone like you might find her. Shasta was the youngest of the family, living just outside the town of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in a small white house with her mother, Brenda Groene, her brothers, 13-year-old Slade and 9-year-old Dylan, and her mother's boyfriend, Mark McKenzie. The house was surrounded by trees and low-lying hills. 9 miles out of the Coeur d'Alene town, the Groene home was completely secluded and offered Brenda, Mark, and their 3 kids a peaceful retreat. However, the family wasn't entirely hidden from prying eyes. It was this scene of domestic bliss that a man named Joseph Duncan noticed as he drove by one day, taking note of Shasta playing with her brother in the yard as he hatched his heinous plan. But what did Joseph Duncan have in store for the family? Coeur d'Alene was a safe and peaceful community where it was typical for parents to let their children play outside and even ride their bikes around with no fear for their safety. But that was about to change. On Sunday, May 15th, 2005, the Groene family hosted a barbecue party with several friends. Brenda's sister, Brandy Hoagland, explained the friendly atmosphere. People just knew that Mark and Brenda had an open door. People just ended up gathering out that evening. I do know there was quite a presence out there that night though. It was a seemingly normal day for friends and family.
We had family there, and so we just went to sleep like it was a normal night. The next day we had to wake up for school.
However, no one at the party had any idea that this was the last time anyone would see Brenda, Mark, or Slade alive. And little did this family know, they were being stalked and closely watched for the last few days. The night of the barbecue hangout, Shasta was woken up by her mother, who was clearly frightened.
She had actually come into the room and woke us up and said that there's a man here that doesn't want us to be here.
The family was then taken into the living room, where the man was standing with a black mask and a firearm in his hands.
I had seen Joseph Duncan. He was very protected and in all black.
Initially, the family thought they were about to be robbed. However, this person, Joseph Duncan, went on to zip tie the wrists and feet of Mark, Brenda, and the 13-year-old Slade and forced them to lay down on the floor. He then tied the hands of 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan and took both of them out on the lawn before he went back in with a hammer.
I remember hearing my mom, like she went to go yell, but didn't have the time to. And then I heard my stepdad, Mark, we were hearing bangs, and then he was screaming and yelling.
And then, miraculously, Slade came stumbling out. He managed to escape. He had somehow freed his legs, but was covered in blood. Duncan chased him and attacked Slade again, this time right in front of his younger siblings. After this, Duncan took Shasta and Dylan into his Jeep, parked right next to the house, and drove away as the kids watched a wounded Slade sit on the picnic table. Duncan drove past the state line, taking the 2 kids 100 miles away in a remote campsite near St. Regis, Montana, a spot surrounded by a dense forest and so secluded that the chances of someone passing by were equal to 0. And this was where Joseph Duncan revealed the truth about their family to the 2 already terrified kids.
He grabbed the hammer, he said, "See this hammer?" And we said, "Yeah," and he was like, "This is the hammer that I murdered your mom and your stepdad and your brother with." And he was like, "They're not alive and you're never gonna see them again."
The revelation completely devastated Shasta and Dylan. But Shasta, despite her young age, quickly realized that their survival depended on courage and strength.
I felt like I was gonna have to fight for my life.
But what about the Groene house? Did someone find out about the violent attack that night? Did anyone notice that Dylan and Shasta were missing? The next morning, a neighbor showed up at the Groene house. Earlier, on May 15th, he agreed to pay Slade some money in return for mowing his lawn. However, he didn't have the correct change to pay the agreed-upon $10 at the time. So, he promised to stop by his house the following day and pay him. When the neighbor arrived, he immediately noticed the back door was open, explaining, "I hovered and nobody came. Then I saw all the blood on the floor." The neighbor immediately called the police.
Okay, you need to talk to a deputy about the vehicle for what reason?
Yeah, I sure do.
Okay, what's going on with the vehicle?
Well, the vehicle, I can't explain it to you. You just have the guy call me quickly.
Well, they need to know what's going on.
The vehicle, there's nothing wrong with the vehicle that I can see. But the vehicle belongs to a guy who is friends with the people that live in this junky house out here. And I went to the door to pay the little kid $10 for mowing the lawn, and there's blood all over the door. Nobody comes to the door. They are friends of the guy who owns this pickup, I find out.
Okay. Okay, let me have a deputy give you a call back at that 661 number then, okay?
Yeah, right away.
All right.
When a team of deputies arrived at the property at 6:15 p.m., they found everything to be just as the neighbor had reported. A lot of blood everywhere, smeared, stained, and even on the walls. The sickening smell of the congealed blood filled the air, and the sight and smell nauseated some of the less experienced deputies. The police team soon discovered pools of blood surrounding the bodies of 2 adults. One of the deputies, who knew the Groenes personally, identified the victims as Mark and Brenda. Nearby, they found the body of their son, Slade. It seemed that he had managed to drag himself inside the house, where he laid at his mother's feet. The house was sealed off and designated as a crime scene.
We have a homicide scene with 1 adult male, 1 adult female, and 1 juvenile male.
But it was just the beginning of their worries, as law enforcement was now faced with one unanswered question. Where was Shasta and Dylan? There was no sign of the youngest siblings. The authorities hoped that the children were staying elsewhere on the night of the attack. However, after checking in with other family and friends, as well as their father, Steve Groene, it was confirmed that Shasta and Dylan had gone missing.
Main concern right now are the 2 children we cannot find.
The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office requested assistance from the FBI and other resources to help locate the missing children. An Amber Alert was also issued nationwide for the 2 children. Authorities and community volunteers scoured the woods around the Groene house and Lake Coeur d'Alene, searching for Shasta and Dylan. As the days turned into weeks, the nation held its breath, gripped by a growing sense of fear. The police continued their relentless search, desperate for any lead that could bring them closer to the missing children, but to no avail. What horrors were Shasta and Dylan enduring? Were they still alive? Where could they be? As the search intensified, the 2 children remained trapped, going through gruesome horrors at the hands of their captor. Over the course of several weeks, Dylan and Shasta endured SA and physical abuse. Shasta recalled, the first hour that he had us at the campsite, he started saying the Lord's Prayer, and then he would have us recite it. While we were reciting the Lord's Prayer, is when he started to SA us. 1 second, he would be saying that he was there because God told him to, and 1 second, he was saying that he was the devil and there to do the devil's work. The 9-year-old Dylan was the main target of Duncan's rage and torture.
Took more of his anger out on Dylan and was really mean to him. And just him up and, just stuff like that.
Duncan would keep the two kids chained to the tree, apart from each other. On multiple occasions, he would take Dylan away for hours, and when the two would come back, the boy would be seriously injured.
I think after a certain amount of time, Dylan had started to lose hope that it was going to turn out good for him.
Watching her brother's spirit dwindle, Shasta became a pillar of strength for both of them. Despite being only 8, she comforted Dylan like a big sister, telling him, "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'm going to make sure that we get out alive." But as time dragged on, hope for rescue only became bleaker.
It felt like forever, waking up every day not knowing if you're going to be alive the next.
Duncan began forcing illegal substances and alcohol on Shasta and Dylan. And once they were under the influence, he would tell them horrifying details of what he did to his previous victims, who were also all children.
He very vividly and in detail described murders of 2 sisters from Seattle, Sammy Jo White and Carmen. He would tell us the way that he had done it, where he had placed their bodies.
This was the case of Sammy Jo and Carmen, who disappeared from the city of Seattle in 1996 while they were living with their mother and brother in a motel. Despite extensive efforts, the police were unable to find any trace of the 2 girls until when their bones were discovered 2 years after their disappearance. But surely, Duncan was just tying himself to the case to scare the kids, right? Regardless of his intentions, he was talking, and 8-year-old Shasta saw an opportunity. Observing that Duncan was attempting to build some sort of connection with her, she decided to use it against him and came up with a plan. She pretended to show interest in what he had to say, to trick Duncan into thinking that she cared for him.
I would ask questions about his life, ask him about his family, and could I meet them one day?
It was a conscious thing, like, I need to make him think that I love him or that I want to be here with him.
It seemed to have an effect on Duncan, but roughly a month had passed by since the kidnapping, with no sign of any rescue or their horrors ending anytime soon. And then things took a turn for the worst. At this point, Duncan had given the 2 kids a sense of hope that he would release them and they would be able to go back to their father. But one morning, as Shasta stood holding her brother's hand, she heard a loud bang. Immediately after, she felt Dylan's hand slipping out of hers. Duncan had shot Dylan. Shasta vividly remembered the scene, explaining, "When I looked down next to me, my brother was basically holding his insides, trying to keep them from falling, and I couldn't talk. I couldn't do anything. I just stared at him. I was in disbelief." Duncan walked up to them and took aim again, this time at Dylan's head. Shasta had witnessed the cold-blooded execution of her brother right in front of her eyes. Up until now, Dylan and Shasta had been each other's support and hope, but now she was all alone. Still unable to process the death of her brother, Duncan made Shasta help move Dylan onto a tarp and add gasoline before burning all evidence.
So I was just confused, and I remember, I think for about a week I just didn't talk. I couldn't talk, I couldn't say anything, I was just frozen.
Alone and terrified, Shasta was trapped with the monster who had ended her family. She yearned for escape, but knew any attempt would likely end in disaster. Despite her terror, Shasta remained remarkably composed. She continued to show interest in whatever Duncan told her, trying to convince him that she cared and hoping to lull him into a false sense of security. However, despite all of her efforts, one day, Duncan decided that he had to put an end to her life. He gave Shasta a choice: A, shoot, as he did with Dylan, B, strangle, a slower and more painful way out. After seeing what happened to Dylan, Shasta settled on option B, explaining, "There was something telling me. That gives you time to talk him out of it." So, Duncan began the ordeal using a rope. Shasta, who was exhausted and traumatized by the loss of her family and 2 months of horrendous abuse, was on the verge of giving up. She remembered seeing white for a moment before she let out the words, "Please, don't, Jet." After hearing that name, Duncan eased his grip and let the rope loose. It was a nickname he had given himself, and he told the kids he liked to be called Jet. He told Shasta, "I don't know why. When you call me that, it just means different. I can tell you really care about me." But how would Shasta keep Duncan's affection? And, more importantly, how would she use it to her advantage? Shasta's last attempt to survive was to manipulate and outsmart her serial killer kidnapper. "I had to start acting like I liked him, or that I wanted to be there for him. Anytime me going home was brought up, I would tell him, 'No, I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you,'" Shasta said. Gradually, Shasta gained his trust and managed to get Duncan to open up and tell her about his life. Around this time, Duncan asked Shasta to be his daughter and call him Dad. Shasta agreed, so Duncan told her he would take Shasta to meet his family. Shasta saw hope. She was inching closer to Duncan, letting her be seen by other people. But the little girl knew that she had to do more, to make sure that she was somewhere she could be recognized. "I told him that I wanted to show him where I went to school and where my best friend lived, and I wanted to show him what my life was like," Shasta said. Shasta was finally successful in convincing Duncan to take her back to her hometown. On their way back, on Saturday, July 2nd, at about 1:30 a.m., Duncan was driving a red Jeep Cherokee with a Missouri license plate and stopped in the parking lot of the Coeur d'Alene Denny's restaurant. This night was about to change everything for both Duncan and Shasta. As the two were walking towards the Denny's, they passed by two young men who were smoking cigarettes outside. One of the young men instantly recognized Shasta Groene.
There was this guy standing outside and he was with his friends and he nodded his head and I nodded my head and he went up to the counter and made it kind of seem like he was conversating with one of the waitresses, and then I seen her look over at me.
Yet, by the time the young man had talked to the waitress, Amber Dean, Amber had already recognized Shasta and told her shift manager.
They were my only table at the time, and I immediately recognized her. His entire world revolved around her. She didn't speak without his permission. Something about the dynamic between the two, it set the hairs on the back of your neck up.
At exactly 1:51 a.m., the manager dialed 911, a call that would change everything.
Yeah, hi. This is the manager, Denise. Yeah. I've got a little girl here with a tall gentleman, and she looks so much like Shasta. Can you describe the male to me? I'd say 6'3". Okay. Really slim. Okay. Dark hair? Yeah, curly. All right, we'll have someone put it that way.
However, the waitress Amber knew it would take at least 8 to 10 minutes for the police to get there. And if the man managed to get out with Shasta, she may never be seen again. So, Amber pretended to have a problem printing their bill. Soon after, 3 police cars arrived at the Denny's with their lights turned off. The officers recognized Shasta right away and walked up to the table.
The cop had asked me what my name was, and I had looked at Joseph Duncan, and he said, "You can tell him." So Joseph Duncan actually told me, "You can tell him." And so I had, said Shasta, and that's when he had, told Joseph Duncan to stand up.
The police immediately arrested Duncan, and Shasta was taken to a local hospital for examination and observation, where she was reunited with her father. While finding Shasta brought relief, not finding Dylan with her was another heartbreak for family and friends. Yes, amidst the celebration of Shasta's survival, the family and community was also confronted with the harsh reality of the Groene family. Shasta vividly revealed even the smallest of details about everything that happened, including the night her family was killed, her and her brother's abduction, the sordid abuse she and her brother went through, and how Duncan took Dylan's life. Based on Shasta's statements, investigators were able to locate the campsite in Montana where Shasta was held captive. Authorities were able to recover several of Duncan's belongings, including a laptop and camcorder. About a week later, forensic data confirmed that the remains discovered at the campsite were of Dylan. But as more was learned about this horrific incident, more questions came up. Who was this Joseph Duncan? How can a person be so evil? What could possibly drive someone to commit such heinous actions? Investigators soon found out the man was legally known as Joseph Edward Duncan III. The 42-year-old was a former Fargo resident and a convicted SO who had previously been charged with multiple SAs. His first recorded crime was in 1978 at the age of 15, when he was caught essaying a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. He was sent to the Jesse Dyslin Boys Ranch, where he confessed to a therapist that he had essayed 6 boys so far. By the time he was 16, he told his therapist that number went up to 13 boys. In fact, one of those cases was documented. In 1980, when Duncan was 16 years old, he stole multiple firearms from a neighbor and abducted a 14-year-old boy, whom he also essayed at gunpoint. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for this crime. After serving 14 years, he was released on parole in 1994. He was arrested again in 1997 after violating the terms of his parole and was re-released in 2000 with time off for good behavior. After this, he moved to Fargo, North Dakota, and began studying computer science. However, despite trying his best to stay out of trouble, whenever there was a missing person or an unsolved SA, police would knock at Duncan's door to investigate him. Retired FBI agent Mike Necco explained this only made things worse. It started to piss Duncan off. It started getting under his skin. He decided, well, if they're going to continue to treat me like this, then fine, I'm gonna go out, do something about it. Duncan again came under legal surveillance in 2004 when he approached a group of young boys at a park in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. He ended up essaying 2 of the boys and was convicted in 2005, but a friend bailed him out of jail by paying $15,000. This was less than a month before he would attack the Groene's house on May 15, 2005. On top of Duncan's extensive criminal history, during the FBI investigation after his arrest at Denny's, Duncan confessed to 2 more inhumanely brutal crimes. The first confession was admitting to the abduction of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez on April 4, 1997, whom he admitted to essaying before executing. The second confession was admitting to taking the lives of 2 girls in Seattle in 1996. These were the same girls he had previously told Shasta and Dylan about: 11-year-old Sammy Jo White and her half-sister, 9-year-old Carmen Cubias, who disappeared on July 6, 1996. Their remains were discovered almost 2 years later in an abandoned barn. During the investigation, authorities also found that Duncan had been keeping an internet diary of sorts, a blog. Duncan wrote voluminously in it and mostly expressed his anger and resentment at the state and law. The blog provided a disturbing insight into his twisted mindset. He wrote, "A friendly officer from the city police department just stopped by to do their quarter offender check. I did not bother asking his name. Each time they seemed to add more and more to the check. This time, they wanted ID and phone number. Yes, I know a lot about abuse from all 3 sides: the victims, the offenders, and the systems. I'm not saying let offenders do their thing. I have no problem with taking direct measures to stop people from hurting people, but I think it is more effective to take direct measures to stop people from wanting to hurt people. I am scared, alone, and confused, and my reaction is to strike out toward the perceived source of my misery, society. My intent is to harm society as much as I can." Throughout his blog, he maintained the narrative that despite his past wrongdoings, he was not an SO, and the system forced him to commit the crimes he did. Of course, as was now plainly clear, this was not the case. But after everything Joseph Duncan had taken from the Groenes, would the family ever receive justice? In October of 2006, Duncan pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and to 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping in the case of the Groene family murder and abduction. It was agreed that his guilty pleas could not be withdrawn, and if he was not convicted in similar pending cases in federal court, the state of Idaho could hold a death sentence trial. Retired FBI agent Don Robinson explained they brought together a lot of evidence to pursue the death penalty because Duncan told us he fantasized about prior victims. I don't want this guy spending the rest of his life sitting in a jail cell, fantasizing about all his prior victims. That's where he derives his pleasure. In April of 2008, 12 jurors were chosen to decide whether Duncan would spend life in prison or face the death penalty. During the trial, jurors were exposed to multiple disturbing pieces of evidence, including a series of unsettling videos Duncan recorded while harming Dylan. Some jurors cried, while others had to look away. Duncan covered his face as the video played. Former Assistant U.S. Federal Attorney Wendy Olson recalled, Joseph Duncan knew that video was so horrific and so awful that there would be no way that anyone could watch it and not think that he was worthy of the death penalty. I think it's the single most disturbing piece of evidence that I have ever seen in my entire life. Following the trial, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge imposed 3 death sentences.
31 years of being involved in the criminal justice system, I have never met a more evil person than Joseph Duncan.
But before justice could be fully served, fate got in the way. On Sunday, March 28, 2021, the U.S. Attorney's Office published a press release that announced that Joseph Duncan had died while he was in custody on death row at Terre Haute Federal Correctional Institution. Just months earlier, in October 2020, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, with medical staff estimating he had 6 to 12 months to live. But what about Shasta? How did she manage to rebuild her life, having endured such a traumatic experience? Shasta tried to move on with her life and live as a normal kid, but with the trauma she faced at such a young age, she struggled in her teen years, falling victim to narcotics and alcohol during middle school.
All the stuff that was going on in my life at that point, there was still court stuff going on with Joseph Duncan, there was still counseling that I had to do, and so I think that all kind of pushed me over the edge a little bit.
She spent a year in the St. Anthony Juvenile Correction Center and moved to Treasure Valley after she came out. She turned her life around after she met Michael Vaughn, whom she later married. A big step forward in life, thanks to the time she spent healing in the correction center. Shasta's resilience and determination allowed her to overcome her past and create a loving family with 5 children of her own. Surrounded by the love of her family, Shasta has found strength in looking forward and refusing to let Joseph Duncan and his actions define her.
I don't hate him for the things that he's done. I forgive him, actually. At some point in my life, I had to come to the conclusion that I'm always going to, if I don't forgive him, then he's going to control my life. But also, I want him to know that I'm doing good things with my life too, so that he knows that he doesn't control my life and that he doesn't affect me anymore.
To this day, Shasta's story remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Her journey is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is hope for healing and growth.